Okay, everybody. So once again, my name is Tom Gabor, and I'm delighted to also introduce my co-author, illustrator for this book project, Violet Lemay, who's done just some amazing work, and you'll get a glimpse of it tonight. We're just going to give you a flavor for our book, and you're going to see that it's unique in terms of its format. Unlike books that are heavily laden with text, this one benefits from Violet's illustrations and design work. And we're hoping to reach a wider audience. We'd like to reach activists. We'd like to reach students and have a greater impact than is the case when you have a book, as I say, heavily laden with text. Now, I just want to say something about myself and then let Violet introduce herself as well. I've written a number of books, as you can see, on the area of gun violence. My introduction to the field, I'm a criminologist and sociologist, studied in the Big Ten. I went to Ohio State University and then went back to Canada, my home country, and taught criminology at the University of Ottawa for 30 years. Now, back in the late 1980s, Canada experienced its greatest horror as far as a mass shooting was concerned. There was a young man, socially awkward young man, who had issues in his dating relationships, as well as career-related issues. Walked into the University of Montreal School for Engineering, went into a classroom, asked the men to leave, and proceeded with his semi-automatic rifle to execute 14 women. And then he went into the corridor and shot other people as well. As you might imagine, Canada, which doesn't experience many mass shootings, certainly not of that magnitude, was in a state of shock. At the time, we had over 1 million people, which translates, if you everything you multiply by a factor of 10 to get to appreciate the number of people who signed this petition. We had 10 million, equivalent to 10 million people signing a petition just in the universities, requesting tighter or demanding tighter gun laws in Canada. And this massacre made the issue of gun violence, elevated it to a top priority for the Liberal government at that time. And then they reached out to me and asked me to produce a literature review at the time, so that was in the early 1990s, examining the relationship between gun availability, homicide, suicide, and deadly accidents. And I was struck by how strong the findings were, showing that while other factors are, of course, are important, social, cultural, economic factors, that gun availability is strongly correlated with lethal violence. I also did work for the United Nations. I was asked to submit an expert report to the Dunblane shooting in Britain was, I guess, the equivalent to the Sandy Hook shooting here, where 16 elementary school children were shot in Scotland, were murdered in Scotland, along with a teacher. There was a national inquiry, and I submitted an expert report to that inquiry, and they subsequently tightened handgun legislation in the UK because it was a handgun that was used for that shooting. I've written 5 books on gun violence since 2016. My last one got me in touch with Violet because it was a book some of you may have heard of, American Carnage, where we debunk about 37 myths on gun violence. And my co-author was Fred Guttenberg. Many of you will know that name. He's Parkland dad, unfortunately. His 14-year-old beautiful daughter was murdered in the Parkland shooting in Florida. We went on a tour a media tour. We were invited to the White House. We addressed the House Democratic Caucus. And it was during our media tour on Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace, where Violet Lemay, was in Malaysia and saw us. And then we got into touch. Violet, you can give us a little more detail on that, but became acquainted, and eventually that contact and connection culminated in the book that we have here today in front of you. So Violet, please say a few words about yourself and how we got to work together.
Sure. Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for joining us tonight. That's a big deal, I think, logging on to a Zoom on a weeknight, so thank you. Yeah, as Tom said, well, I was living in Malaysia when I first heard him speak on Nicole Wallace's show, and I was so taken with him. I'm an American, but my family and I moved out of the country in 2015 for my husband's job. We first moved to New Zealand, and it was when I was living in New Zealand that I first had my sort of like my calling to this cause when 2 mosques were shot up in Christchurch in, I think it was 2019, which was the first big mass shooting in New Zealand. It was just absolutely horrible. In response to that, because I'm a children's book illustrator, I wrote this cute little lift the flap book for babies called Let's Be Friends, which just showed that we can be friends with anybody, even if they're different than us, which is just sort of how my brain processes things, I guess. And then my family and I moved to Malaysia, which is where I was living when Uvalde happened. And I was just so shaken by that tragedy. And I'll explain how this all happened in a minute, but ended up getting in touch with the family of Alethea Ramirez, who was an artist. Like me, my son is an artist, my husband is an artist, we're all artists. And I felt such a connection to her. And because I was able to connect with her family and they agreed to help me with their input and help, I released the book Alethea Ramirez Was an Artist. And then, as Tom said, caught up with him when he was doing his tour for American Carnage. And yeah, I reached out to him and said, I read your book. Well, I read it after seeing him. I was so impressed with Tom and Fred, just with their fresh, frank wisdom. They spoke with such clarity. And I thought the book was amazing. And because I'm a visual person and a visual learner, I just thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we could take similar content to what Tom and Fred put in American Carnage, but show it visually? Because my background before I was in children's books was illustrating for magazines and newspapers. I illustrated a lot of political stuff. And anyway, so I just thought a book with infographics that showed the data would help people like me understand and remember the information, because I feel it is so important to be informed when you're having conversations with people, to back up what you're saying with data. And for me, I struggle to remember. So I just thought a very, very visual book like this, it would help me remember, remember all the good data that I need to know to back up what I'm saying. So that's how that happened.
Thank you, Violet. We're delighted to receive some very positive advance praise for the book. So you'll see, I'll just quickly give you some ideas of what people have said about the book. Here's something from Carolyn Light, a director from Harvard University, who wrote a book on Stand Your Ground, basically history of America's lethal defense. And Fred Guttenberg, the Parkland dad, also is very positive in his praise. And as well as Paul Murray, many of you know her. She's one of the most active activists in the United States. She literally lived next door to the Sandy Hook shooter and has felt a special obligation to do something about gun violence. And she's one of the most prominent activists in the country. So on with the book. And we begin with a quote from Vivek Murthy. who was the US Surgeon General under President Joe Biden. And for the first time, we had an advisory from a Surgeon General to the effect proclaiming that firearms violence is an urgent public health crisis. And it's particularly consequential because the current administration, the Trump administration, has now removed this advisory from the website, for example, of Health and Human Services. And as far as I can see, they've provided no justification based on research or our knowledge of policy. It was purely a partisan decision. And the current administration is very strongly, closely aligned with the gun lobby. Now, why is gun violence a major public health concern? Well, each year we have between 40 to 50,000 gun deaths, certainly in the last few years, and which is quite the outlier relative to the rest of the advanced world or high-income countries. For example, Japan, which almost has half the American population, has fewer than 10 gun deaths a year. So 40 to 50,000 versus 10. We are a considerable outlier, and we have graphs in our book that show that and show the difference in the odds of dying from gunfire in the United States relative to other countries. Now, one statistic that's often overlooked are the non-fatal injuries. And we have over 100,000 people who suffer non-fatal injuries from gunshot wounds or gunfire, I should say. And these can be obviously debilitating because the victims are disproportionately young. People, even when they survive, they can have severe brain, spinal column, or other injuries that curtail their ability to live a normal life. And they can live a life full of pain as well and not have or be able to benefit from intimate relationships and the types of things that most of us aspire to in our lifetimes. Now, a good example of how long-lasting some of these injuries are, I think of Anne-Marie Hochhalter. Some of you may know her name. She was shot in the Columbine shooting in 1999. We just passed the anniversary of that horror. And Anne-Marie passed away about a month ago. So she was paralyzed and suffered great pain for 26 years and eventually succumbed to injuries related to the shooting. Another tragic aspect of that shooting was that her mother committed suicide within a year following the shooting. There was also, in relation to the Montreal massacre that I described earlier, there was a 10-year follow-up of that massacre, of that shooting. And the litany of suicides, divorces, and even issues with alcohol and substance abuse in general is quite astounding. There was one case of a young man, you recall I mentioned that the gunman went into a classroom, asked the men to leave. One of the men who left felt such survivor's guilt that he eventually committed suicide. And then both his parents committed suicide following his suicide. So you can see that the number of people, the ripple effect, if you will, of these shootings goes well beyond the individuals who are directly affected. But even those who are directly affected, we're looking at over 150,000 a year in the United States who are either injured or suffer lethal injuries. As far as mass shootings are concerned, we have over one per day on average in the United States. So we've had 4 consecutive years from 2020 through 2023, when, if your source is the Gun Violence Archive and there are disputes about what definition we should use with regard to mass shootings, But if we rely on the gun violence archive, which is 4 people shot, not necessarily killed, excluding the shooter, in one general location, we've had 600 per year or more for 4 consecutive years. Many countries experience at most 1 to 2 mass shootings a year. We're experiencing 600. We're somewhat down this year, fortunately, but we're probably, because summer tends to be busier as far as mass shootings are concerned, that we may end up with approximately, if the current pace continues, probably somewhere around 500 mass shootings, which is still about double what we experienced 7-8 years ago in the US. Now, another alarming statistic that many of you have probably seen is that unlike other comparable countries, guns are the #1 cause of death of those under 20 years of age, children and teens in the US. And historically, it's been car crashes and cancer that were the leading causes of death for young people under 20. But we've seen almost a doubling between 2011 and 2021 of gun deaths for this age group. So if you look at this chart that we have, the US is the only country among some of these high-income countries where gun deaths are the leading cause of death. Canada, you can see the 5th country on this list, and Switzerland, it's the 3rd leading cause of death. In other countries, it's further down in terms of cause of death. So we're really an outlier as far as that's concerned. A very alarming situation and something that we should be paying a great deal of attention to. I'm sure you will agree. This too struck me. There was a study by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which found that over half of all Americans, specifically, they found 54% of Americans have been personally affected by gun violence, meaning that they're either shot, have been shot or intimidated with a gun, had a family member shot, or witnessed a shooting. So you would think that we've reached critical mass in terms of the America's contact or connection with gun violence, that so many Americans have been touched with gun violence, and you would think that we would be ripe for reform. But unfortunately, there are political and other considerations that stand in the way of the type of reform that many Americans seek. Young people, when interviewed in an annual survey by the American Psychological Association, found that teens and young adults report that their #1 fear is getting caught in the middle of a mass or school shooting. It's the top stressor for them. Also, we're finding that close to 1/3 of all Americans indicate that they avoid certain spaces due to their fear of gun violence. So they avoid crowded places, for example, crowded malls, avoid crowded theaters. Maybe many of you, anytime I've spoken to an audience, I ask people, when you go to a movie theater or some other theater, do you check where the exits are? Do you factor in the possibility that a shooter may enter? And many people respond in the affirmative. So sadly, that's a consideration that's kind of in the back of our minds when we engage in our daily activities. Now, I'll just submit a few hypotheses, if you wish, of why the US is a global outlier. First one being our exceptionally high gun ownership levels. And studies from the Geneva School of Advanced International Studies has found, based on surveys around the world, that the US has approximately 120 guns for every 100 people. Contrast that with Japan or Indonesia, which have fewer than one gun per 100 people. So just a massive difference. And the US is number one in the world in terms of the number of privately held guns. We account for about 4% of the world's population, but nearly half of all the privately held guns in the world. Another reason one can postulate that we are a global outlier is in our permissive carry laws. Most advanced countries have tight regulations regarding concealed carry. Here we have concealed carry allowed in every state. A growing number of states now have permitless carry, meaning there's no requirement for an individual to have a permit, to get training in marksmanship, training in the safe handling of guns, or training in the law as to when it is appropriate to use lethal force. Contrast the policy here in the United States in general, or policies, with Canada. At any given time, Canada has a population of 40 million approximately. At any given time, there may be 100 people in the country who have a permit to carry a gun. You have to make the case that there's either an occupational need based on you're carrying cash proceeds from your business to the bank, or you need to prove, the onus is on the owner to prove that there's an imminent, the person is facing an imminent threat to their lives, and law enforcement can't protect them. So there's a strong onus on the individual to show that they're in great peril should they not be able to carry a gun, a concealed firearm. Open carry is not permitted at all by civilians. We also have a lack of national safe storage laws, which most other countries have. And we know that in the US, there's a minimum of 5 million homes in which you have children living and guns are unsecured. They're loaded and they are not locked up. Contrast that with Germany, where in order to receive a license to have a gun in the home, well, guns need to be stored, either locked up or stored separate from ammunition. And an individual must demonstrate the process or demonstrate the manner in which they're going to store a gun. And if there is an emergency, the authorities can make an unannounced inspection. If they've heard that there's potential danger emanating from a home, they can make an unannounced inspection of a home to ensure that guns held in that home are secured. So very different policy with regard to storage than what we have in the United States, which is nothing. Basically, I think Massachusetts probably has the strictest laws as far as safe storage is concerned. Then there's the lack of regulation of assault weapons. As I say here, the US is the only advanced country that doesn't ban or severely restrict assault-style weapons like the AR-15s. And you look at this graph, and it's one of Violet's beautiful, creative, and original, I have to say, illustrations. In the 1990s, we had approximately 400,000 assault-style firearms in the United States. In 2023, we had, it's estimated we had over 20 million. So there's been a 50-fold increase in the per capita number, 54-fold increase in the number of assault-style weapons in the US over a 25-year period. And this would very likely account for the deadlier incidents that we've seen over the last 15 years. Virtually, except for Virginia Tech, but the top 10 deadliest mass shootings in the United States have been committed in the last 15 years, and all of them have involved these military-style firearms, such as the AR-15 or AK-47. One of the myths in our field is that America is a evenly split country. 50% favor stricter laws, 50% want more permissive laws. And that myth has the impact of causing paralysis in the population. People are resigned and say, well, you know, there are just as many people who oppose reform and oppose stricter laws than favor reform. And in fact, as indicated here, more than 6 times as many Americans say it's too easy to buy a gun as those who say it's too hard to do so. As this graph indicates, and it's taken from a Fox News poll, 80% or more Americans actually favor universal background checks, red flag laws, waiting periods to be able to purchase a gun, and a number of other types of legislation mentioned here. So an overwhelming percentage of Americans favor some significant change in these areas. Assault weapons ban, it's a little less, but it's approximately, it varies from time to time and depending on whether we've had some horrific mass shooting, but it's a little over half of Americans favor banning assault weapons. So we see that there's an appetite for change in this country. There's an appetite for stricter laws, and yet we see throughout the country, at the level of the states, there's tends to be a loosening of gun laws. We're seeing it's approximately 30 states now that don't require a permit to carry. And the bill has been introduced by Republicans in the House of Representatives, calling for concealed carry reciprocity, which would basically mean that you could carry a gun and take it from the states with some of the loosest laws and bring it into states that have the stricter laws. So this would effectively lead to the entire country having extremely loose, if any, controls over the carrying of guns. And Florida as well, the state that I live in now, is considering open carry. We're one of the few that don't have open carry, but open carry without requiring any permits whatsoever. And one other, what I call pernicious myth, is that gun violence is confined only to a few urban areas, and that's often inner cities, and that's often a code word for people of color, and that we don't have a national problem. So this is a narrative we hear from folks in the gun lobby and their allies, that gun violence is confined to very few parts of the country, specifically inner cities. And in fact, one of the partners of WAVE, I know, the Centers for American Progress, did an analysis which showed that between 2016 and 2020, in fact, close to 2/3 of the US counties with the most gun homicides were rural. And that, in fact, the gun death rate, which includes suicide, per 100,000 was substantially higher in rural communities than it was in large metropolitan areas. So this shows that, in fact, gun violence is a national problem. It's a problem in every state. It's a problem whether you're in a rural area, suburban area, or live in a city. That doesn't mean that if you look at cities, that there's a uniform level of violence in every community, but certainly it does mean that rural areas have their share of gun mortality. And just a couple of additional slides, and then we'll get back to Violet to talk a little bit about the power of illustrations in this area and in engendering change. I think one of the most noteworthy findings in this area has been that between 1999 and 2023, over a 25-year period, largely, I would say, because of the gun lobby's campaign to convince Americans that they're safer carrying a gun. That back in 1999, just a quarter of those who bought a gun bought it for self-defense, for self-protection. Most bought guns for hunting, collecting, target shooting, and so forth. This is almost tripled now, because currently about 3/4 of those purchasing guns are purchasing them for self-protection. And why is that important? It has consequences on the ground, because if people buy guns for hunting, they have no problem locking them up, taking the ammunition out. But if you're purchasing a gun for self-protection, you're more likely to carry a gun on a daily basis, and we've seen an increase in daily carrying in the United States. And also, you're more likely to keep a gun loaded and accessible in the home, and we've seen that increasing. So it's not surprising that we see incidents, as we have in the past, in the recent past, where an individual knocks on the wrong door, and the homeowner, there was an incident in Kansas that's still being litigated, and the homeowner fires through the door at the individual, this young man who knocked on his door, mistaking it for some other home. And there was a case of these young people who drove into, I guess you might say, the wrong driveway. They were looking for an event, a party at a home, and the homeowner shot at them and mortally wounded one of the occupants, a young lady in the car. So these individuals clearly had guns at the ready. They had them accessible, ready to go. They reacted very quickly. Whereas if those guns were locked up, not quite so accessible, they might have chosen another way to deal with the situation, perhaps even de-escalation, perhaps asking the individual who's knocking on their door or driving onto their driveway why they were there, or trying some de-escalation strategy where necessary, rather than immediately firing their gun. But because the gun is accessible and available and loaded, it's more likely to be used. And here's one final photograph that we came up with from the Kansas Historical Society. And this shows a sign in Dodge City, Kansas, which, as you recall, was one of the most notorious cities in the Old West. And it says very clearly, the sign, that the carrying of firearms is strictly prohibited. So there's this myth about the Wild West, this myth that you had daily shootouts, that there was no regulation at all. And in the towns, nothing could be further from the truth. Many Western towns had bans on carrying firearms in town, or at the very least, when they entered a saloon or other similar establishment, they had to surrender their gun till they left that saloon. So why is this consequential? This is what some people refer to as a foundational myth about the country, because people who believe that we were highly unregulated in our founding years. There was also strict laws during the Revolutionary period in the colonies and the early states that formed in New England and so forth. There were very strict laws regarding letting the authorities know what your guns you owned. There were regular musters or gatherings where people indicated what guns they owned, and those guns could be seized for use in the militia. So there were actually strict laws in the past, and one can argue we had 40 states, in fact, in the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s, that banned or restricted the carrying of guns due to rising violence. Today, you can carry in every state. And as I said, an increasing number of states don't require any training at all. So people who believe, there are many Americans who believe that the laws today are more strict than they were in the past, in the early years of our republic. So they're more receptive to what they think is returning to the roots of this country, to America's natural state, which is unregulated use of firearms and ownership of firearms and acquisition of firearms. And that simply isn't the case. In fact, their laws are often more extreme today than they were in the past. And Violet, I turn it over to you to talk about the power of images.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, the power of images. When Tom asked me to talk about this, I thought, oh gosh, it's a whole college course, really. But just very briefly, obviously, we all know the saying, an image tells 1,000 words. So true. It's very true for me as a visual person. This illustration, which is in the book, shows this in process. So your eyes take in the image, whatever it is. Hopefully it cements itself into your brain, so that when the moment arises, you can recall it and out it comes from your mouth. So we hope that that is true with the images in our book. For me in my life, with all images, I would say that's true. You can go to the next slide, Tom. Thanks. Yeah, so this shows another way that artists use imagery as activism. These are murals that were painted of the victims of the Uvalde tragedy. Volunteers flocked to Uvalde and painted victims of all the murals right after that event. And that town is just completely transformed if you drive through Uvalde, which I have had the opportunity to do. It's quite interesting, small town, to see it just packed with all these murals everywhere you look. Makes quite a statement. Go ahead, Tom. Right. So as for me, I'm an illustrator. When the Uvalde tragedy happened, the only way I could think of to respond was to use my social media to create some kind of campaign. So, and I have a history of illustrating biographies, illustrated biographies for kids. So it was sort of my natural instinct to create portraits, illustrated portraits of all the Uvalde victims, which I posted. And I would use hashtags when I posted them. And the two on the left there are two I created of Alethea Ramirez. And because of the hashtags, her family connected with me. And that's how my picture book, Alethea Ramirez Was an Artist, came to be. Next slide, Tom. Right. And then subsequently, it takes a year or two to create a book from start to finish between the work you do on it, and then there's the lag time when it's being printed at the publisher and all of that. During that time, when I was working on the Uvalde book, other things were happening. I heard Tom and Fred, as I mentioned earlier, and I created two different subsequent campaigns where I just illustrated quotes, just wonderful, wise things that people who were smarter than me were saying that were inspiring to me, and I wanted to share them with the world. So for me, using Instagram in particular as a platform for visual activism has been very important. Next slide, Tom. Oh yeah, and then I just wanted to show you a few more. Tom has already shown you a little glimpse inside the book, but these are just a few slides to show some of the visuals and infographics that I created. I'm really hoping that they help readers process and understand the data, which, as you've heard Tom talking, I'm sure you've been surprised. I mean, I've worked on this book for 2 years and I'm still surprised every time I hear some of these statistics. But I hope that the visuals help cement them in your mind and will help you recall them in your own efforts of activism so that you can share some of these shocking statistics with other people. And I think there's just one more, Tom. So, yep, there you go. Back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Violet. And this shows what an outlier this graph, United States is, and we're in interesting company with Yemen following suit, which has experienced the civil war for many years now, and we're still way ahead of the pack. Exceptional, but obviously not in a positive way relative to the rest of the world in terms of our private holdings of firearms. Just wanted to end by saying that what is our contribution to the cause? We are trying to reach a wider audience. It's obvious that the generations coming up tend to be more visual. People are reading fewer books. So we're trying primarily to reach activists, trying to reach students. and people who also, members of the general public who don't read a lot of books and a great deal of text. And here I don't mean to be in any way demeaning with the second bullet, but there's so many activists out there with passion, and they bring such drive to this field, deservedly so, because of the um, fatalities and because of the impact of gun violence on our society. But we think it's imperative that for the credibility of the movement, that activists do try to inform themselves as well as possible, because often they do find themselves presenting at a legislature regarding some new bill that's being introduced. They speak to the media, they interact regularly with the public. So I think it's very important for the credibility of the gun violence prevention movement that we have informed spokespeople. And every activist is out there. So they are, in a sense, spokespeople for the movement, and they're trying to grow the movement. And I sometimes shudder when I hear somebody not knowing the difference between, say, a fully automatic and semi-automatic firearm, or not understanding the full meaning of universal background checks or something like that. So it's not that we have covered every one of those issues, but we've tried to identify some core material in this book, and hopefully with the very tight, concise text that we have, and the wonderful illustrations. It never ceases to amaze me. Violet seemed to find in every illustration a different way to present the data. So it also makes for an easy path going through the book. And have gone through it multiple times. And within a few hours, really, somebody can get through the book, and hopefully some of those illustrations will stick with them. Just a final word. Tyler asked me to let you know where you could pick up the book. Obviously, Barnes and Noble and Amazon, but also we're very supportive of independent bookstores. And I know they're kind of not an extinct, but an endangered species in society. So please support your independent bookstores. And if they don't have the book, they'll order it for you. And just our contact information, please reach out. We love to hear from you and get your feedback on the book. We both have our websites here, and we have the social media activity. You can see that Violet's is more extensive than mine. I'm active on Facebook, on Blue Sky, and still have a presence on X. Violet, I don't know if you'd like to say something about your presence or your website.
I would just add that for authors, having followers and engaged followers is extremely important for us. It helps us get new contracts and make more books. So beyond even the fact that we would just really love to hear from you, it would help us out and help us in our continued efforts too, if you all would follow us. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Violet. And I'd like to thank all of you for being with us tonight, and looking forward to some questions that you may have or comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much yet again. Tom, I don't know if you want to stop your screen share for the Q&A, but feel free to leave it up to you if you'd like to.
Am I just now? Oh no, here we go. How's that? There we go.
Looks great. I just wanted to connect this to something Wave has coming up. Just 3 weeks away, May 20th, we have our biannual day of action at the Capitol. It's our biggest event every 2 years, trying to get activists into Madison to talk to their legislators. And, a perfect way you could study up ahead of your conversation with your legislative staff member is by reading this short book. I really think it is a great guide just to understanding the basics, going from not really knowing much about the policy to being somebody that can really speak about it, as Tom did so well. And I want to compliment, I just started this job within the past year. I've watched a lot of hour-long videos introducing gun violence prevention. Tom, that was one of the best I've seen. So way to go. The content was excellent. Oh, Heidi just stole my thunder. I had the sign up for our day of action and the book buy link ready to go in the chat. So feel free to do that. I won't take any more time. I'm sure people have plenty of questions. So I'd like to, yeah, Tom and Violet are nice enough to um take a couple
Absolutely.
questions.
And thank you, Tyler, for your kind words. And thank you for everybody for sticking around. I see you're still with us.
I see a comment. May I just respond to a comment here?
Of course,
Just
yeah.
wanted to ask- So one of the comments asked if we could share the slides after the presentation. Tom, is that okay with you if we?
That's okay with me. Yes.
Okay, I'll send the slides to you, Tyler. So Tyler
Perfect.
will. Okay.
Yep, you'll get a follow-up from us, and we'll also send out the recording to everyone that's registered for our events. So we'll be good to go there.
Okay, we're just rolling down. Do you see another question, Violet? I see a few.
Well, while you're scrolling, Tom, I would like to add one more comment, which is I agree with everything Tom said about everything, but in particular, how this book is definitely helpful to activists for all of the different roles that they play. And also, I think just at a personal level, when I think of it, it's just for me and my family and friends. Just Tom and I were talking recently about how grassroots is everything is grassroots right now. If we want to make change in America, it's kind of at the grassroots level. And with this issue, I think talking to family and friends, let alone reporters, but just like family and friends, I think it's so important to share facts with people because people just don't know. I think people have a hazy sort of view in their mind of what reality is, but that hazy view is not supported by facts. So anyway, that's it.
Right. If I may comment on a couple of comments and questions. One was that many police officers, this is a very good point, that many police officers, we see so many mistakes happening and the use of lethal force being used when it ought not to have been used, and excessive force and use of firearms when it would appear not to have been necessary. And so we see many mistakes being made by police officers and jumpy police officers. And it's been argued that the more armed the population is, the more vulnerable not only are the police, but the population as well, because the police are jumpy. And as one, I think it was Lieutenant Stamper or Chief Stamper of the Seattle Police once said, that the scariest thing, nothing scarier than a scared cop. And if police believing that the majority of the population they're going to encounter are armed, that leads them to be prone to making more mistakes and to using lethal force when it wouldn't have been necessary. So when we see that police are making so many mistakes and they're trained and receive ongoing training and marksmanship and so forth, and even police officers we know in combat situations, they're hitting the mark only in 1 in 6 shots. How will the growing number of civilians in the United States, in states that are deregulating and not requiring any kind of training whatsoever, how are these citizens going to respond in a combat situation? It's very frightening. And they're as likely to shoot themselves, shoot bystanders and so forth, and shoot people when, there's no use of force policies when it comes to civilians. Police have those use of force policies and the training and so on, and they're still making all those mistakes. So that's very, very frightening. And another comment that was made by Dr. Hargarden, and I'm familiar with your work. Thank you for being here today. I think your idea is excellent to have an accompanying set of slides, and we can certainly will take this up with our publisher. Unfortunately, publishers are struggling these days, but I think it's a wonderful idea and we will certainly take it up with them. Violet, do you see any other questions?
I saw one request for our email addresses, Tom. I don't know if you want to share
Sure,
that.
my email address, you'll also find it on our websites. My website is thomasgaborbooks.com. but my email address is tgabor, Tgabor, author, at gmail.com. Tgabor, author, at gmail.com. Violet?
Oh, mine, right. I typed it into the chat, but it's art0violet@gmail.com. Just all one word, art0violet. Yeah. And you can also, ever, if you just think of it, don't have the email address, but want to reach me, there are other ways to reach me through my website, which is just my name, violetlemay.com.
I'm very humbled by these comments. Thank you very much. They're very positive. And we really do, getting feedback from you as activists, as researchers, is vital for us as we go forward in our work. So we really not only welcome your comments, including negative ones, we welcome, but we encourage your comments. Please engage with us and follow us on social media by all means, and set us straight when we're wrong.
There's a new comment you might want to respond to, Tom, if you scroll down to the bottom
Okay.
of the chat.
I'm not as savvy technically as some, so please bear with me. As a fire, yeah, well, we hear about, for sure, most firearms owners are responsible individuals. After all, we have 70, 80, 90 million firearms owners in the United States, depending on what estimates you trust. And the vast majority are not involved in using firearms against people, against themselves, and so forth. So it is a relatively small percentage of gun owners. And if you're referring to, when you talk about a death cult in America, toxic masculinity, which seems to be enjoying a resurgence in America. And certainly there's been a narrative on the part of the gun lobby since the 1980s. And we talked about in our book, American Carnage with Fred, is because the gun lobby and the industry was experiencing downturn. Hunting was on the decline. The draft ended, and many people were introduced to guns through military service. So there was a crisis for the gun industry, and they decided to proceed with the narrative, creating more increasingly lethal products and convincing young men of, that this is your man card, getting an AR-15. And it's a symbol of your masculinity and so forth. And so, yes, this narrative has been with us now for 30 to 40 years. And a lot of young men are buying into it. And we have a tremendous job to do in terms of cultural change and also convincing people about the dangers that these firearms present. So, I guess that's all I can say. Yes, there is a death cult, but, I consider suicide, and we have segments of our society like veterans who've experienced multiple traumas and so forth, PTSD, and are particularly vulnerable to suicide by firearm. I consider that a legitimate exercise as well. And so these people are, I guess, experience personal crises, and having an available firearm will make it more likely that they will use it. So this isn't a death cult. This is an individual trying to resolve a problem. Unfortunately, we know suicidologists tell us that only 10 to 15% of people who commit suicide are actually have an unwavering commitment to kill themselves. The vast majority of people who attempt suicide never repeat. So if your attempt is with a lethal weapon like a firearm, and it's got a 90% lethality rate, as opposed to, say, using pills, which have a 2% rate, you're going to get a lot more lethality, and that's unfortunately the consequence of it. So, in some ways, having the presence of firearms, especially where you have an individual who is unstable or at high risk, is problematic. And that's where also the red flag laws come in. But so it's not just a death cult. Firearms are a tool that unfortunately make killing much more likely, whether it's self-inflicted or an attack on somebody else. That's we hear this all the time. That's one mantra you hear from the gun lobby and the zealots is, guns don't kill. People do, but guns enable killing. We know in attacks, depending on the study you believe, that where a gun is used, a firearm is used as opposed to a knife, you have 3 to 5 times greater likelihood of a fatality. So guns are a tool, just like carpenters have tools that are effective, surgeons have tools. Guns provide an effective tool for killing. And so they are always a part of that dynamic. Obviously, the individual is important, understanding them and their motives and intent. The culture is important. We have to tackle all these things holistically to deal with the problem that America faces.
Tom, I think Heidi has a question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for all of this information. It feels really important, and I really appreciate how accessible it is. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the structure of the book is that it feels like the illustrations with all the facts and information feel like it really balances the knowledge with the humanness, because that's the heart of this, right? Like, we're here because of people being hurt. And so, it's clear that you've both worked very, very closely with survivors and victims of gun violence. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how that has influenced or changed the way you approach this work, to have worked so closely alongside survivors.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll start and say, well, my co-author of my last book, again, Fred Guttenberg, we got to know each other very well. And the Parkland shooting happened just down the road from me. So that was my greatest, you might say, immersion into the area of gun violence, having grown up in Canada in a city. Canada still has a high rate of gun ownership relative to, say, many European countries and other countries. But most people didn't experience or have direct relationship with gun violence. But that connection with Fred and seeing the impact on his family, seeing the devastation of the community. One of the things that happens that many people aren't familiar with is that it's not just, gun violence doesn't just impact the direct victim or even just, I'm not using just to minimize it, but the family. It affects so many people who are in contact with that family, but also devastates communities. Parkland is a case in point. Sandy Hook is another one where there's a stigma that arises. Nobody wants to move there. And in fact, I can tell you that a fairly significant proportion of the Parkland community moved, if only to the next community. And the other thing that happens to victims, and Jennifer Guttenberg, the mother of Jamie, who was murdered, the 14-year-old who was murdered, talks about the fact that everywhere she went, she was triggered. Because you go to, the grocery store, and you remember you were with that child at that grocery store or a park or what have you. So every place in that community triggered her. And so they felt compelled to leave and start fresh, start a new life. So it's one of the things that happens, that communities get devastated. And we even hear there's some data that shows that property values in communities that face these mass shootings also decline. So there's just multitudinous, I guess, impacts of gun violence that people never even think of. And you'll see Jennifer's very emotional statement that she made. It was in the book, from her victim impact statement. That was at the trial of the shooter. That was the statement that she read. And also one of the excellent illustrations of Violet was it not Jessie, the mother of Alicia Ramirez in Uvalde, and she talks about being broken. So Heidi, I completely agree with you. Those visuals complement so well the text, and that's what we were hoping to do. It's really, you have to make emotional appeals in this area to reach people. It's not sufficient just to, I've learned grudgingly, because I was a data person and a researcher, that statistics aren't enough, that you have to show what's underneath those statistics and the suffering that people experience who go through gun violence. Violet?
Well, yeah, Tom mentioned Alethea's mother, Jess Hernandez, who is a good friend of mine. She is a completely broken person, and I don't know how anyone can recover from the death of a child like that. Alethea had two younger siblings, so Jess is a single mom trying to just live her life while being completely broken, and a mother. Yeah, talking about being human, it's been quite something to watch. For me as an artist, I'm a visual artist, but I also write. And I've heard that data will get you so far with people, but people resonate more with stories. Stories are more meaningful, perhaps, to some people. They remember stories. And so, yeah, I've just been, Tom and I'm not sure what his stats are, but for me, I probably write 10 books for every one that gets published. So we're always writing and writing and writing and trying to sell these books. But I've written, I've been trying to process all of this and write fiction that shows the after effects of gun violence on a family. It's such a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. My mind can't get all the way around it. And I just can't believe that America doesn't make changes. I was living in New Zealand during the mosque attacks in Christchurch, and the laws changed almost overnight. And the government bought back automatic weapons, which people freely gave. And, everything just changed right away. So by contrast, it's just shocking to see America's lack of response.
Yeah. I see one, I know we're probably coming to the end of our time, but I see one comment made by Frank. And we're certainly not in a position to say how much to share with your daughter, but I would just recommend maybe, and you probably have done this, reaching out to others with a similar experience, even joining groups and getting their suggestions. But every situation is different. Every child is different in terms of how much you share. We had one big dilemma we had in this book, because it is a graphic book, and some people think that means there's all kinds of gory stuff in there, gory illustrations. But we did consider one visual that didn't involve people. It was a church shooting. You might remember the Sutherland Springs, the biggest horror church shooting in the United States. It happened, I think, the month after the Las Vegas shooting back in 2017. And we had a photo, I think from the Washington Post, of walls being riddled by bullets and chairs, pews overturned and so forth, without any people in it. Some blood on the walls, but small amounts. And we had a dilemma, because on one hand, my feeling is, I don't want to speak for Violet, I don't want to sanitize this. That's what I did as a professor for 30 years. I refused to sanitize violence. It's ugly. And people have to see the full ugliness, if you wish, of it. But at the same time, we were truly concerned that if we put one illustration like that, and that's why you'll see in the book that Violet has drawn some silhouettes. So this is not based on a real shooting, just giving an indication of, all the bullet holes that might go into a person in say, a school shooting. But we were concerned that one graphic illustration could mean that this can't get into the schools. And we're hoping, we've had support, tremendous exposure with the American Federation of Teachers. In their American Educator, they featured our book, and we were very humbled by it. And we know there's tremendous headwinds getting this kind of book in the schools. But we're told by people high up in the American Federation of Teachers that they think this would be appropriate for even middle schools and high school students. So it's a real challenge. We want them to read it, not just for sales, obviously, but we want to influence and inform young people and get them involved in this field. And so we kept that visual out, even though I think it would have had tremendous impact.
Well, thank you both again for this awesome event. I'm going to now stop the recording.